Exotic pet owners get a bad rap for a lot of reasons, and non-traditional pets are banned to some degree in every state. One reason often given for why exotic pets should be illegal is that keeping them is detrimental to the environment because of their extreme potential to escape and become an invasive species. The common narrative is that exotic pets are either escaping or being released into the wild and easily outcompeting animals in the natural environment. At first glance, it's easy to see why people think this. After all, Florida is famous for its population of Burmese pythons, green iguanas, tegus, and countless other introduced reptiles that seem to be taking over the state and competing with native wildlife. In tropical waters, lionfish that apparently escaped from the pet trade are proliferating, prompting Floridians to promote the fish as a delicacy in the seafood market. Invasive species seem like a huge problem, and they are. However, what factors cause a species to become invasive? Let's start by looking at some of the worst invasive species in the United States and how they got there. There are many invasive animals throughout the world that are blamed for their large populations and displacement of native wildlife. If you Google the phrase worst invasive species, you'll find several possible contenders. Many are animals, but some are also plants and fungi. There's the northern snakehead, which is thought to have been released by pet owners and those who kept the fish for food purposes into several fresh bodies of water throughout the US. Then there's the nutria, a highly invasive rodent that was brought to the United States in 1889 for its fur and was released when the market crashed in the 1940s. And of course, there's the famous Burmese python. These massive snakes are causing serious ecological damage in the Florida Everglades, and unfortunately, the pet trade is to blame, whether they've come from intentional release or escaped a holding facility during Hurricane Andrew. The Global Invasive Species Database has a list called 100 of the world's worst invasive alien species. According to its description, species were selected for the list according to two criteria: their serious impact on biological diversity and/or human activities, and their illustration of important issues surrounding biological invasion. Included on the list are animals like the common or brown tree snake, which might have been introduced to control rats, the cane toad, which was introduced to control crop pests, and the ubiquitous house mouse. As for animals that have been introduced from the exotic pet trade, there's the common or Indian hill mania bird, of which the populations in Israel and the Spanish islands are said to partially have originated from escapes from exotic bird facilities and pet shops. The walking catfish was imported into Florida in the 1960s, and it is speculated that they escaped into the environment from aquaculture facilities. The common carp has also been intentionally released for ornamental and sports purposes. The zebra mussel and Chinese mitten crab may have been introduced by aquarium dumping, but also by boat hulls and commercial barges. The red-eared slider is an extremely recognizable species of turtle that, while native to the United States, has spread to other states where they are not native because of escapes and releases from the pet trade, where it is extremely popular. Although the turtle has been imported for food purposes in some cultures and may have spread through that pathway. So there you have it. There are some cases where exotic pets have become established as invasive species thanks to the pet trade. But that's not all. There are also domesticated animals on the list, and they are the domesticated goat, rabbits, feral pigs, and of course domesticated cats. Domestic cats are arguably some of the most prolific invasive species, not just in the United States, but around the world, said to be responsible for the killing of 1 billion birds per year in the United States alone, and they exist in high populations in all 50 states, something no exotic pet trade descending species has accomplished. In fact, nearly every traditional so-called domesticated species has some level of invasiveness in the environment, from the insane amount of goldfish that rapidly reproduce in freshwater lakes, to feral chickens in Hawaii, and even the often romanticized wild horses that exist from the vast western plains to the shores of North Carolina. The common domestic pet is no stranger to spreading in the wild, despite the widespread belief that domesticated animals cannot survive without humans. Therefore, we can at least deduce that there is nothing inherent to so-called exotic pets that make them prone to becoming invasive in the environment. It seems that any animal can potentially become established in the wild. So what does this mean? Well, maybe exotic pets should all be banned to prevent any more animals from becoming established, and we should all be restricted to keeping the domesticated pets that are already here. After all, there are so many animals from the pet trade that have easily become invasive just from the accidental escapes of a few animals. Well, actually, many of the worst invasive species in the United States, as well as globally, were intentionally introduced. In the 19th and 20th centuries, there were associations called acclimatization societies. These were groups of volunteers that actually encouraged the introduction of non-native plant and animal species around the world. The species they chose were those deemed useful, as well as those that were familiar to Europeans. In these older times, it was not yet known how much damage non-native species could cause when introduced. The house sparrow is a common sight in the United States, as well as around the world, and populations of this ubiquitous bird were released in Brooklyn with the hopes of controlling caterpillars. This is a common historical scenario with some of the world's worst invasive species. Other species that have been intentionally introduced include the red deer by acclimatization societies into several countries, the gray squirrel to Europe, the mosquito fish, which was released into New Zealand for mosquito control, the Indian mongoose for control of rats and snakes, the crab-eating macaque for live trapping and export for medical research, and stoats for control of rabbits and voles. The rainbow trout was introduced for anglers, the American black bass, common tilapia, and brown trout for aquaculture and sport fishing, bullfrogs for ornamental purposes as well as for the control of agricultural insect pests, starlings for insect control in New Zealand and in the United States, allegedly to introduce all the birds from the works of Shakespeare, and finally, the red fox, which has become extremely prolific in Australia, was intentionally introduced for sport hunting. There are countless more animals labeled as some of the worst invasive species that were actually helped by humans to establish their surging populations. Many of these species likely either wouldn't have successfully spread if it weren't for people intentionally trying to establish them, or their populations would be far less prolific. We've often heard the claim that the pet trade will inevitably lead to the occurrence of accidental escapes and a few unscrupulous owners releasing their pets into the environment, which will ultimately result in that species becoming invasive. However, surviving and certainly successfully reproducing in a completely foreign environment is not as easy for animals as it may sound. In fact, there have even been cases where humans have intentionally tried to establish a species in a new area, only for the experiment to fail. Your best shot at establishing a new species would be to release numerous wild-caught animals simultaneously that are of breeding age and are not completely used to the spoils of captivity. Not all of these animals will survive, but the larger the population, the more likely that a few of them will manage to stay alive long enough to reproduce and for natural selection to take place. It also helps to release animals into a location with few natural predators. Therefore, it's not a coincidence that the most prolific invasive species are also species that are commonly owned or have had large populations of animals introduced to the environment simultaneously. This could be why domesticated animals like cats and goldfish are so successful at spreading, as these species are extremely common in captivity. However, ironically, it is the least popular species that face the most bans in the United States. Exotic pets that are uncommonly owned are often claimed to be prohibited, at least in part, due to their potential to become invasive, and most of these animals are mammals, despite invasive species largely being plants, invertebrates, fish, birds, and reptiles. There are over 100 non-mammals that can fit the definition of invasive in the United States that come from the pet trade. But just how many mammals from the exotic pet trade have become invasive? The answer to this question? Probably less than 10, and all of them are based in Florida. They are listed as follows. There's the Mexican red-bellied squirrel, which is said to have been introduced by a resident of Elliott Key, Florida, and these rodents began swimming to adjacent islands. However, after Hurricane Andrew, the populations were severely reduced and are now limited to Elliott Key. There are also monkeys that live in Florida. There are vervet monkey populations in Broward County that descended from a tourist attraction, of which they were released in the 1950s and 70s. In the 1930s, a glass-bottom boat operator released 6 six rhesus macaques onto an island in the Silver Springs State Park with the hopes of creating a Tarzan-themed attraction. However, when the monkeys started swimming away from the island, they were replaced with new additions. There's also a small population of squirrel monkeys in Fort Lauderdale that have descended from releases in the 1970s. There have been 5 separate populations introduced throughout the state, and this population is the only which remains. Prairie dogs were reported at the Miami airport in the 1970s, but the species did not persist long in the wild. In 2004, a small breeding population of Gambian pouch rats were reported to have established themselves from escapees of a breeding facility on Grassy Key. These 6 species are the only confirmed invasives that have originated from some form of the exotic pet trade, including zoological facilities that I can find, and most of them are limited to small regions in Florida. Some were intentionally introduced, and some may even potentially be extirpated. Therefore, exotic mammals from the pet trade pose the smallest threat to biodiversity by a substantial margin. Their low popularity as pets likely making them less likely to have enough intentional and accidental escapes to establish populations. So why are they the biggest targets of bans? Exotic pet mammals are also often banned due to the perception that they are dangerous, disease-ridden, or unethical to own. The truth is, exotic mammals are just downright strange, and owners of them are often not given consideration when it comes to their freedom to choose pets outside of traditional species. They are no more likely to become invasive than their reptile and bird counterparts, which are legal in most states, and the vast majority of all invasive populations from pet trades exist in Florida, where the climate is warm enough. Now that the era of ignorance towards the harm of releasing exotic animals into the environment is long past, there isn't such a large number of new species becoming introduced, but sadly, the mistakes people made in the past have permanently altered the ecosystem for good. Education is key to ensuring that exotic animals are properly contained and never intentionally released into the environment for any reason.